Will DC Comics' massive layoffs cripple the comic book industry? Well, the comic book store industry, they're going to have a lot of problems because of this. They already had a lot of problems. They're going to have even more problems. We will get into it in the article. However, if you want to support my work, definitely huge help to me. Subscribe, click the bell for notifications. Also, check out collegeofthedead.com and get a copy of College of the Dead Graduation Day, my ongoing zombie apocalypse color series. You can also get the first one. Check it out. Also, epicmermaids.com, you can sign up for The Mermaids. It's an email list. You'll be notified when the book launches. Definitely sign up for that. It's also a huge help to me. All right, back to it. This is coming from, they call themselves Meow or something like that. This is a cool aspect. It's an interesting aspect of the DC Comics layoffs. People kind of discussing and commenting on how comic book stores are going to be affected by the DC Comics layoffs. What are the DC Comics layoffs? WarnerMedia, which is owned by AT&T, WarnerMedia's CEO, Jason Kilar, who used to be the CEO of Hulu, has decided to remake all of WarnerMedia into some direct-to-consumer streaming monstrous successful thing. In doing that, he started off kind of getting to know everybody over the course of about 90 days, and then he started firing people. So he's fired a ton of people, 1,000 people out of 25,000 people. A bunch of them worked at DC Comics, but many of them were in HBO and their other movie divisions and stuff like that. So he's cutting a lot of fat, but he's also freeing up a lot of space where they can kind of figure out how do we modify what we're doing, be more of a brand-focused, direct-to-consumer, streaming, new media from the old media type of thing. So he seems like a really sharp executive. He's gotten a lot of leeway to do whatever he wants to do, and he's doing it. So far, in the comic book side, we've seen a lot of layoffs at DC Comics. It's like a third of DC Comics editorial and production staff. How many people is that? It seems like a hell of a lot. I don't know. I don't know exactly how many, but it's a lot. It included the editor-in-chief. It included Jim Lee, who is now in a creative role as a liaison with the branded division. So basically, he's got no responsibilities for planning any of the publishing. They closed down DC Direct, made statues and toys by themselves. They're not going to do that anymore. They're going to license it all out. They also closed down their collected editions division, which took scans and remade their old books and made new, beautiful collector's editions of those. Not a viable business, apparently. So they are sending that out to be licensed to someone else, and they're reorganizing and focusing it down to a company where DC can produce their intellectual properties, send them out to the other divisions to make movies and streaming and TV shows and things like that, and also boost their licensing. As far as what they're going to do with periodical comics, that's the least attractive thing that they can possibly be doing over there anymore. So they're going to cut back on periodical comics. Obviously, they just announced today Aquaman 65, last issue. There'll be a lot more announcements like that. So let's get a little further into the article. Layoffs that hit a major comics publishing company like DC Comics does not bode well for the comics industry as a whole. Now, with respect to the comic industry, this is the comic book store industry that gets the most affected. There are many places that comic books are sold. It's not just through comic book stores. Now, it used to be through comic book stores and newsstands and bookstores and mass market outlets. It's evolved a little bit. So there's no more sales on newsstands, practically none. There are some publishers, mostly just the major ones, that will sell some on a returnable basis through Walmart. There's an independent publisher called Allegiance that started as a Comicsgate publisher that's now doing a few months worth of comics. They're going to see how they go in Walmart. Hopefully they go great. But as someone who's been through that before, I can tell you that the returnable sales as an independent publisher is not viable. So hopefully it works out for them. They made beautiful comics, but for the most part, it doesn't work. So in any event, DC Comics has been successful selling through Walmart. They have a good relationship there with their mainstream fancy schmancy, Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman characters that everybody knows. And they'll be selling there. DC also sells, and comics are sold as graphic novels through the bookstore trade, which is substantial. It's like 300 million, not DC only, but 400 million a year worth of sales to bookstore and mass market outlets like Amazon, Walmart, places like that for graphic novels. DC only has 10% of that market, believe it or not. Scholastic has 40% of it, and Marvel only has about 10% of it. So they'll probably focus on that a lot more, and then licensing other young adult versions of their books and things like that. But as far as like crowdfunding, that's been going bigger than ever. I've showed you crowdfunding projects on Indiegogo. And there's also still Kickstarter. There are people doing campaigns and business on there. So it's just that things have kind of evolved. Now, the comic book store industry, though, that did used to be like a pretty sizable niche. Now there are less than 2,000 comic book stores. So Chuck Rozanski was saying a couple of months ago, and he's the owner of Mile High Comics. He's been in comics since the 1970s, reselling comics. He's got a very big operation, milehighcomics.com. And as an industry expert, he's been involved with all the big ones and through a lot of the substantial changes and development of the industry. He said he thinks that they already passed the tipping point a few months ago, meaning the tipping point where it's not viable to focus on producing periodicals anymore. And if you think about it, we've all kind of known this, right? I mean, we've all kind of known that it doesn't really make sense to publish comic books in a periodical format. Because we know that, they're really focused on the licensing and they're not, they want to make video games. It's like, so that means that the periodicals that we're making, if people are, if it's not a viable business by itself, then it's not a viable business. And you don't need as many periodicals coming out. Maybe some periodicals, a few, but that's a big difference than, 50 or 60 or 80 periodicals a month. It's just not necessary. They'll lose. God knows how much money they were losing on publishing especially some of their weaker titles. So they're not going to continue to do that. They'll do what they have to do to keep some characters alive, anthologies or whatever they're going to do, backup stories, things like that. But they are going to focus on mass market, and they're going to focus on what makes sense in terms of making some money, exploiting these characters, and looking at opportunities to exploit new characters. But at the point where we all knew that individual comics didn't make financial sense, that's when the industry died. When people weren't going into the business. When Valiant 1.0 was very big, and that was the first launch of Valiant Comics, Jim Shooter's company, in whatever it was, 89, 1990, they didn't even allow licensing. People wanted to make posters and shirts and things like that. And Shooter was so focused on producing just the comic books and controlling the consumer experience with respect to his brands, he didn't want any licensing. They allowed foreign country reprints, like foreign language reprints, but they didn't allow licensing. They wouldn't produce even their own merchandise. They just were focused on selling the paper. Things have changed since then. And once that's become more and more like not viable, going, say, 1994, 1995, and people just started saying, look, we can make movies, TV shows, toys, statues. Then the focus shifted. And at some point, you can't just keep making periodicals and taking advantage of the fans and just saying, okay, well, look, we're going to get all sorts of other things and toys and stuff. It's like you can do all that, but then the periodical, people aren't figuring out how to market periodicals. And now with the way technology is, periodicals really not the most reasonable way to get your stories across. Graphic novels, 48 pages plus, seems to be the way to go. Okay, so just getting back to the article over here, DC Comics has done its best to deal with a bad situation, it says, in controversial ways. So DC cut ties with Diamond Comic distributors. It was very interesting when they did cut ties with Diamond Comic distributors, because they stopped distributing through Diamond and all of a sudden were selling to retail stores through two big mail order distributors, the two biggest ones. They just basically cut Diamond out and then directly started selling to these two mail order operations. So they said to the mail order operations, hey, sure, you can sell to stores also if you want to. And they just dropped it on the comic book store industry, which, it's not a big business. The main thing was they wanted to make sure that their direct-to-consumer customers who actually cared about the characters so much that they were getting them through these mail order operations and they're getting them at a big substantial discount. They wanted to make sure they still got comics. And then they figured, okay, sure, you can sell to comic book collector stores as well. The problem is that there are so few comic book stores left that it's become the new newsstand. It's just a very, very small market for any publisher to consider selling into. And that's been the problem. That's really been the problem. So according to Hollywood Reporter, roughly 1/3 of DC's editorial ranks are being laid off. The names of those who've been laid off include Bob Harris, Senior Vice President of Publishing Strategy and Support Services, Hank Canales. They even laid off Mark Doyle, who oversaw the sort of successful Black Label line of DC Comics for non-canon mature tales of the DC universe. And they even laid off, which is pretty interesting, the person who was a senior vice president in charge of sales for the direct market, which is comic book stores, as well as newsstand sales. They don't need the guy anymore. They just completely phased out his position because their focus on selling the periodicals is just direct to consumer, either through digital or through the two big mail order operations that also service a few stores. But they're not going to think about marketing. They're not going to think about how do we get into those stores and get more shelf space in those stores, because it's a problem of scale. So they can't put management energy into trying to figure out how in the heck can we sell more comics in comic stores. It's like, well, there aren't comic stores to sell them in. It's like, how can we sell more on the newsstands? You can't. There are no newsstands to sell them on. So that's why, they'll sell them to Walmart, and they have whatever merchandising agreement they have with Walmart that the numbers work and things function. But Walmart apparently can buy a lot more to become relevant than comic book stores. So they'll focus on the Walmart relationship, but they're not focusing on comic book stores anymore. They still are fine with the mail order guys, but they're not fine with the comic book stores. They walked away from them. DC Comics is one of the big two in comics publishing. All eyes are on Marvel to see how it's holding up. How is Marvel holding up? You want to know how they're holding up? It's the same as DC Comics. They just sort of produce comics because they sort of produce comics. They make money off of the licensing and films and things like that. Marvel will do what DC just did, obviously. And now they have even more reason to keep up with DC. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So these layoffs are... so this is from a fan. So these layoffs are huge, and it looks like they may or may not be trying to kill all their angles other than the big money makers. Okay, well, that doesn't really sound like that makes a lot of sense. But, a comics industry without DC Comics. Well, it's a comic book store industry without DC Comics. But there are going to be new Batman comics. But don't expect there to necessarily be new Aquaman comics. They just canceled that series. There may be a standalone Aquaman graphic novel, so a self-contained story that has potential to be spun into a future movie or animated feature or something they can do for a TV show. But for them to do periodicals without a sense of how that is translatable realistically into other media immediately, at least for development immediately of a TV show, a movie, an animated something streaming, it's not going to happen. They're going to coordinate this as you would logically do if you were looking at the business and you were doing it yourself. Some speculate this might lead to a greater shift than ever towards digital-only comics, a major blow for brick-and-mortar comic stores through the United States. The comics industry may transition to predominantly digital, which would kill so many amazing shops. Well, there's nothing to do to save the shops. If the shops want to survive, Chuck Rozanski told shops how to survive. He's been telling them the same thing for years. You need to buy old comics for 5 cents on the dollar and sell them for $1. Then you have profit margin. Then the comics don't lose their value, and you make money. And as Chuck Rozanski says, there's always someone who's going through a divorce, no longer wants to collect comics, has to move, whatever the reason might be, needs to raise quick cash. They bring in 10 long boxes of comics. The retailer, who's an expert, looks at the comics and says, okay, I can actually resell some of this stuff, and here's $100. Sometimes people would come by and just drop off boxes of comics just to get rid of them. Be like, well, I didn't really want to throw them away. All right, fine. Well, they pay $10 a long box, whatever. They're not worth the money as a collection, dumping them on a retail store, than they would be selling them individually on eBay. Think of all the hours and hours and hours it takes to sell them on eBay. So, as Chuck Rozanski says, he sees himself as a recycling center for pop culture. That's the business model for a comic book store. Not buying new comics and getting them at 50% off cover price and trying to sell them within a few days before they become unsaleable. That's not a normal business model. Comic books, non-returnable comic books, first came onto the scene in the 1970s, and they were used as a way to keep people coming and looking at old back issues. And that is their natural existence. That's where they belong. They don't belong being 80% of a comic book store's revenues. Maybe 10% or 5% of a comic book store's revenues should be these new releases. Okay. In digital sales aren't going to do it because people will buy some digital, but they're not buying enough digital to subsidize the cost of production. So will there be digital graphic novels? Sure. Will there be some digital of what otherwise periodical? Yes, but it's not a viable market for people to put a lot of money into the production of digital. It's just like an extra thing you can sell if you already own the rights to it. I own the rights to a lot of digital material, a lot of back issues. Eventually I'll get around to doing something with them. People keep asking me about it. Moving along, others have a more cynical view of the whole thing, pointing out that layoffs like this hurt creators the most, while leaving the higher-ups in a relatively safe position. So this is like immature. This is to understand, like, we live in a merit-based society. It's a capitalist society. It's going to always be that way. So you should always treat creators with respect. You should always give people opportunities. And a long-term relationship with creative people is what creating successful creative content is all about. You have to respect your creative talent. You have to make sure they're doing okay. You have to make sure it's a good opportunity for people that are working together mutually. But these people don't get a sophisticated, like, mutually beneficial professional relationship. Quote, once again, as usual in the comics industry, the people who actually produce and make the stories and art we all love get tossed out, while the corporate owners who continue nothing but to own the right, who contribute nothing but own the rights, get to hold on to all of it, writes one fan. For the privilege of owning a comic book company and other companies, AT&T paid $109 billion. Was it too much? Yes, it was too much. They may get that money plus a profit. I don't know. But they didn't contribute nothing. They contributed $109 billion. They're like $150 billion in debt. So it's a little hard to say that the people on top contribute nothing. They contribute a little bit of something, like $109 billion. That said, for creative people, if you're making your own comics and you want to, like, be able to continue and pay your bills, you got to hustle. You got to sell your own ideas. Or at the very least, you have to work with people that you can see is going to be a long-term relationship. Like, invest in that relationship because you know that that person that's hiring you, that publisher that's hiring you, needs you. You have to think that way when you're working with people. And also, I take work, but with my other business, I take work from multiple clients. It's a niche-oriented business, and we have multiple clients. So if we don't have one client or lost another client, we have 4 or 5 other clients lined up right behind them. So you kind of have to do that. You have to network and make sure you always have access to business. But if you're a comic book artist or a comic book writer, and you're looking at, like, I want a nice stable business, I want a nice stable life, and I want to make good money on a consistent basis, and that's your chosen line of work, this is not the time for it. The only way to do it is to crowdfund, like we're doing. Join a comics gate or whatnot. Get in there, find out what it's all about, because publishers are cutting back on the number of comics they're doing because it's not making them money anymore. So think about it. For the most part, however, fans are too stunned by the news to be able to even speculate what this might mean for the comics industry as a whole. Well, they wouldn't know. Scores of fans have taken to Twitter to offer their condolences for those laid off, with one fan writing, "I don't even know what to say. All of my sympathies to those at DC Comics," mine too. Both those affected and those who retain their jobs. This is a horrible day for the comics industry. It's a good day for the comics industry. It's very unfortunate that people's lives are interrupted like this and that fans aren't going to get comics that they want. But the reality is this has been a long time coming. Ever since we knew that people were making periodical comics because they really wanted to get movies and toys and merchandise out of them, that was the end of the periodical comic book business. When newsstands died, that was the next end of the periodical comic book business, when we couldn't sell viably to newsstands anymore. And then when we saw retail stores go from 12,000 or more in the 1990s to now less than 2,000, and they're not even all dedicated, viable comic book stores, that's the end of it. So it's been falling apart for a long time. And the evolution that's going to continue from this is, yes, there will be some people that make some periodical comics, but there are not going to be giant companies that are subsidizing the costs of producing comic books at a loss just because they might be able to make more movies or toys out of them in the future. It's going to be very limited. But what you will see is you'll see more graphic novels. You'll see crowdfunding. You'll see, like we were talking about before, there are creators that want to be able to make their own comics. They'll be consistent. They'll build their own audience. They'll do crowdfunding. They'll be successful because they want to be in the business and they want stability. The only way to have stability as a comic book artist or writer is you have two options. One, you publish your own ideas, you publish your own work, or you collaborate with one person and you get your own stuff coming out steady, and stick with your own stuff, build your own social media, your own customer base. Your other option is you work for someone who's a publisher who needs you. You know, you're a great fit for them and they will keep you on, but you still become very dependent on them. Always do your best work as a creator. And if you're not doing your best work when you're creating comics, that is killing your future. So always do that. That's my best advice. So yes, this will absolutely damage the remaining comic book stores. Expect a lot more of them to go out of business, sadly. But the ones that focus on back issues can buy their inventory at 5 cents on the dollar and sell it for $1, sell it for 50 cents, continue to make money. They'll sell online. They'll do just fine. There'll be people that come out and reinvent themselves. Definitely check out milehighcomics.com. Chuck Rozanski has a very interesting website, a very interesting blog, and he's got a cool YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the description to it as well. All right. If you want to support my work, and I appreciate it, I need to see your comments. Tell me what you think of this article and this discussion. What do you think is going to happen to comic book stores in the future of the comic book industry? And subscribe to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Check out collegeofthedead.com. Get a copy of College of the Dead Graduation Day. I'm putting out more comics. I'm never going to stop putting out comics. I love doing it. I've got a great fan base. Why the heck would I? In fact, you can also go to epicmermaids.com and sign up for The Mermaids. It's going to be an ongoing series. It's full color. It's completely done. It's 48 pages. It's like Game of Thrones with mermaids. It's extremely well written. This is only the first book. This will be an ongoing series. I think you're going to really like it. All right. I will see you again soon with another video. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.